this continual expansion of NATO. It doesn't actually strengthen NATO. A lot of these new countries are really liabilities rather than assets for the reasons that you've given. They could be the trigger that starts a war. They bring very little to the alliance, but they could be the cause of war, where the other countries are obligated to come into their support. So, yeah, I don't think NATO has been very rational. I think you could say the same thing about EU. There's this kind of focus on, expansion. It's kind of like maybe analogous to a church that's always focusing on proselytizing and bringing in new members and not actually providing spiritual nourishment to the members that they have. So you see some of that. Again, NATO looked very, very powerful on paper, but we're finding out that these countries, I think probably because for such a long time, that there really wasn't any serious threat of war. Just like the military-industrial complex in this country, there were a lot of corrupt practices became established. Nobody's really thinking about war, but everybody's thinking about money, about lining their own pockets. And that happened in Europe just as much as it's happened here in this country. So, when actually a real war broke out, we found out that they really didn't have very many weapons. And a lot of these weapons were maybe very impressive, when they were demonstrated at these arms expos or whatever. But in a real war, they're just not very effective. There was a very interesting, it was actually a study done by the Bundeswehr, which is the German military. And it was released in one of the major German magazines. But they had done a very careful analysis of how German equipment had performed in the Ukraine war. And what they found was that that their performance was very disappointing. The main thing is that these things were very expensive. That's a problem. And then they just, they're delicate. They break down quickly. And then when they break down, they're very, very difficult to repair and maintain. And this is something that we had been saying earlier, but it's good to find, a study actually done, by a NATO member that reached the same conclusion. So it's a lot of things, like just over time, they were so separated from the reality. Again, it was just about making bucks. And so you created weapons that, again, were very impressive at these shows where you could get these contracts, but they don't really prove very useful in a real war. That's what we're finding, and that's what we're finding about NATO in general.
Right. Yeah, I hear the U.S. On the news when there's a spokesperson talking about, they use the term "our allies" all the time, like our allies across the globe, our allies, but I just feel like we don't really have allies. We say we have allies, but I'm getting this feeling that we don't really have friends anymore. Do you think there's any truth to that? Yeah. Like, what are our real allies? Do we have real assets? And should we seek allies? I mean, I feel like we should just seek better relations with the other superpowers, with Russia, with China, right, with Iran, instead of siding with, okay, we got Finland now. All right, China, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
I don't know what the idea is, but
right. Yeah. The problem with alliances, true military alliances that involve mutual defense pacts. If one of us gets attacked, then we got to go to the aid of the others. That these alliances become entangling, right? And that's obviously the risk. So the more so-called allies they have, actually, the greater the risk that something could go wrong. You've made all these promises to different countries, and you don't know, really what these countries are doing. A lot of times, it was the case in Georgia in 2008. Georgia had been designated a future member of NATO, and they launched a war against Russia, killed Russian peacekeepers back in 2008. A lot of times these smaller countries have an incentive. Their incentive, the way they look at it is very different. They say, wow, we joined this great alliance. Now we have this 800-pound gorilla at our back. Now we can act tough with Russia or, whatever country. And they become very irresponsible. Without the so-called alliance, they would probably be very, very much more cautious, much more willing to, negotiate with Russia, for example. But with the 800-pound gorilla at their back, they can be extremely reckless. and you can actually encourage war, rather than prevent it, rather than deter attacks. You can actually, well, spark a real war. So that's the dangers. Now, whether or not we have real allies, well, it's kind of hard to say right now. I think like up through Biden, yeah, it was just sort of, at least through
On paper,
inertia. But these are old, yeah, alliances that are just kind of built into the institutions and of Europe, and actually all these people like the presidents of European countries, the European Commission, they were firmly embedded within U.S. led global hegemony. That was their understanding. So they did see themselves, you could say allies, or maybe just or as perhaps vassal states, some of us who are take a more jaundiced view of them might say. But I think it was real, at least at that institutional level. Those ties were really very, very strong. Now, and I don't think it was to their benefit. I mean, that's what, again, people like Viktor Orban, whatever, said that, no, it just makes much more sense for us, instead of being part of this league of nations, we should try to be maintain relations with all countries of the world. But now under Trump, those institutional ties have really come under strain. That's what we're seeing. And so that the alliance has suffered real damage. The U.S. European alliance, that is the core of what NATO is all about. That's why we call it the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because it's transatlantic. But that's been it hasn't broken, but it's been put under a tremendous amount of strain, and it remains to be seen. How long it's going to last? Will it really ever recover its former glory, if that's what it was? I don't know.
right? I feel like this is the end of NATO. Do you believe so as well? Like it may exist just for a while longer in terms of just a big money laundering scheme, but as a true defensive alliance, I feel like it's really been shattered through this Ukraine war. It doesn't seem it didn't serve its function. It's been exposed to be a bit of a paper tiger, and it just shows all the divisions, the problem of these entangling alliances. Of this that the people in France aren't going to want to fight a war for Georgia or Ukraine. Especially if it's something that is being heavily provoked by NATO.
Well, yeah, I don't think it's the end of NATO yet. And you could even make the argument that NATO might, in the end, be strengthened, because saying the big part of the problem was that there really was no credible threat for so many years, ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, and that has helped to hollow out NATO. It's just that people pretended that, okay, yeah, we have our militaries, but it's just they're never going to fight. We don't have to really train them. Who cares if this equipment works? As long as we're all making money off of it. I think there's been that kind of attitude for a while, but there's a chance now that, especially if Russia goes marching to Kiev and Odessa and whatever, that the reaction in Europe could lead to a strengthening of NATO. It could happen. I don't see why, it just might say, oh, we have a real enemy now. Now clearly these leaders like Macron and Sterkarmer are trying to make that case now, but they don't seem to be going very far. They've had all these conferences, they've tried to establish the so-called coalition of the willing, but virtually nobody wants to join them in it. Again, it's just that. So,
do you really think so? Do you think that NATO could get strengthened through this?
Well, it's possible. I just say theoretically possible, but I mean, I guess you just look at by and large, it seems like most of these countries are, even when you look at France and England, it's just in general, the populaces are not behind this. It's not something, or even the militaries. It was like in the UK, Keir Starmer, he's been one of the the most vocal and about sending troops to Ukraine. But the British military, their generals and admirals, they actually leaked, made some spoke, to the press. I can't remember. I think it was the Telegraph. It's one of the major leading papers in the UK, and they described it. They described Keir Starmer's rhetoric as just political theater. And they're saying that we just don't have the capability to do this. Even to send so-called peacekeeping troops and maintain them there for any length of time. We just don't have it. So their own militaries. I guess that's part of it. It's just that they can talk a lot, and some of them can, make these threats, but they can't back them up. I think that's the truth, and often their militaries realize that. And then you just don't find the desire within the population to support these, to make the financial sacrifices, for example. Now the elites are demanding it. They're saying that, okay, we're going to have to cut back, and this is happening, actually, in the UK, where they're cutting fairly basic social services. And I think the same has happened in Germany, and more cuts are threatened. Yeah. And but none of this is winning votes. It's not winning hearts and minds. So so far they're not really. They haven't been able to convince their people. Now, maybe that's one reason. If the Russians start marching fast, and it just the front just collapses completely, and there's this real fear. I think it would be unjustified, but a fear that they're just marching all the way to the Polish border, and who knows, they may just keep on going there or something. Perhaps you could start to convince those people, and then perhaps you're going to get a real, there would be an enemy that could just, like the old Soviet enemy that could truly strengthen NATO. Give it a purpose again. Right now they pretend like they have a purpose, but it seems like when push comes to shove, they don't really believe it. So yeah, I'm saying theoretically, NATO could be strengthened, but I don't see any signs of that happening yet. It's just talk from certain leaders like Macron and Keir Starmer, and they're always the Baltic states, but they just don't matter. They're just tiny little countries that have always been rabidly anti-Russian.
Right. I don't think that it would ever happen. I just think that one of the biggest weaknesses that was exposed in this Ukraine conflict was the lack of any manufacturing base within the Western world. And that is just crucial if you want to really be a leading military power. And I think that's just something that we've just completely overlooked. Everybody just didn't think about that. I mean, we're seeing it right now happening in the United States with the tariff war that we're trying to bring manufacturing back. And Trump is realizing, hey, it's not that easy. We're seeing it in Europe right now. They're saying, okay, let's stop making BMWs and start making tanks. And like, it's not that easy. We can't just flip a switch. We have production lines that need to be created. We need to be able to source all the parts for this. It takes decades to build a real proper manufacturing base. Plus, they've cut themselves off of energy in Europe as well. So it just... That, I think, in itself is almost the death knell for NATO. The fact that they've run out of munitions and they haven't been able to ramp up production, and the cost for them to ramp up production is just so high, and it's such a long time horizon that I just don't see it being politically or economically viable. Unless they were truly threatened, that they really, really felt like, okay, I need to defend my homeland, then you can really get everybody... get the Rosie the Riveter spirit, and then get it done. Maybe.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's been more than 3 years, and it's amazing. At the end of these 3 years, the European military is so much NATO in general is much weaker than when this conflict began. You would think that, they would have started ramping up production immediately. They've had some success, but very minor. Essentially, they failed. And, after 3 years, now they're talking big. They have plans to recreate the munitions industry in Europe. But yeah, I'll believe it when I see it. I have my doubts about this.
Yeah, I highly doubt we're going to see it. But if NATO does kind of fall apart and we don't really regard the Western Europeans as true allies anymore, or they don't regard us as allies anymore, what happens? Does all these nations, do they start to float around and gravitate to other poles in the multipolar world? And if that's the case, do you think anybody would gravitate towards the US pole? I mean, I feel like the US is isolating itself through all of its actions, through the tariffs and just and all these conflicts or support of Israel and the genocide in Gaza. We're losing the hearts and minds of people all around the world. So when this multipolar world takes form and we see countries begin to decide, I'm going to park my ship with China and Russia and the BRICS and deal with this. And will we see European countries start doing that? Do you think anybody's going to want to come over to our club? You know, like our club is the one that failed. You know, it's that's what I'm kind of worried about in the future. I feel like we will be isolated. I feel like it's happening right now that we become just a loser sitting in the corner, and we deserve it, you know. But what do you think?
Yeah. Well, yeah, potentially. I mean, we're not there yet. The U.S. is still, in so many ways, it's. I don't know if it's truly the global superpower anymore, but it is a global superpower, and.
But nobody likes it anymore.
Yeah,
it's
well,
a global super that nobody likes.
Right. Well, I think, first Biden himself and previous administrations did a lot of damage. But, that was generally, again, it was aimed directly at, Russia and China and Iran. And this time, and there was collateral damage in Europe. I think a lot of the, again, the European people are not happy about the way that Europe has been treated. They've become, I think, or at least many Europeans have been made very much aware of their vassal status, and they understand that they have paid the price, for this Project Ukraine. They've So, yeah, even under Biden and the previous administrations, our policies, I think, were losing friends. And certainly, the support of the unqualified, the unconditional support for Israel has damaged our reputation around the world. But this has been exacerbated, of course, by Trump, who hasn't really essentially changed. Maybe we do have seen some improvement in relations. I think it's real enough between the U.S. and Russia, but not between the U.S. and China, not between the U.S. and Iran. The overall policies are still in place, but we've added to that these attacks, on European and other allies. Often in the form of tariffs. That's the main thing, but it's more than that. It's just clear. It's clear that Trump does not like the European elites, and he doesn't really hide the fact. He's not very diplomatic about it. That's one thing Trump is not. He's not diplomatic. So yeah, I mean, it's just like I think our overall position in the world has the decline that preceded Trump is accelerated. And you say, well, possibly within our hemisphere,
the Canadians don't really like us.
Yeah, well, the thing is, you can say, well, with brute force, we've made the Panamanians do some things and the Colombians do some things, because these are very, very weak countries that are quite dependent on us. And so we can throw our weight around and get some things from these people. This is not really a good long-term strategy. Policies or alliances, well, that are based on fear are not really alliances. You can get countries to bend the knee to you, but they don't love you, and they're probably always looking for a way out. And in countries like Canada, Canada, the joke is that they basically were like the 51st state. Most Americans look at Canadians as just, it's just the backyard of America, and what's the difference? Now, can you talk to Canadians and they'll insist that it's all very, very different, but I have my own doubts about that. But amazingly, one thing that maybe Trump will end up achieving, ironically, is a real Canadian consciousness and an actual. We may see a Canada that no longer is just the backyard, but that's actually standing up to America. And so, yeah, in the end, even in our own hemisphere, I think our position has been weakened.